I think we really reached the goal of, as I was saying in the introduction, of radically reconceptualize urban nature. I think in a very different way you address this. David, in a way, was more about the city and the countryside relation, or society-nature opposition. And in the case of Matthew, through this small example, I mean, question what we mean by urban nature. So let's try to go over some question and maybe some relation with the Brussels environment. I would say that maybe if we try to relate to what Bernard was saying in the introduction, one of the questions that raised maybe more Matthew's presentation is the relation between, but both also David, is the relation between social policy and green policy or natural protection policy that are at the moment part of urban policy and of the ERDF, so let's say policy, but that often are difficult, very difficult to get to merge together, let's say, as one objective. And sometimes when you answer one, you don't answer the other. The example of the sustainable, I would say, neighbor that you were presenting is an example of like that, I would say. And maybe another thing, and then I'll let you to see what we want to answer, is maybe the relation of the city and its environment. You were mentioning, David, that the city is very often seen as completely separated from its hinterland, if we can still speak of an hinterland, probably not. Brussels, in the case of the Brussels region, we have a very small region that is in a very urbanized area, so in a way we are already much beyond in geographical terms of this difference between city and natural hinterland. But at the same time, the fact that the political I would say authority of Brussels region is very separated from the rest of Belgium, of the rest of Europe, get back to the idea of a city that is governed, let's say, with something different around it and without really a relation. It's not really a question, but I don't know if you want to go on these, let's say, ideas.
Well, I'd be very happy specifically to address that second one, and maybe kind of challenge you a little bit. So one of the things, a photograph that I use when I'm for teaching urban environmental relations that always gets a laugh is it's a photo of just a really nice looking forest, and it's a Canadian forest, so it's pine trees. And we're talking about what is a city, what isn't a city, what makes up a city. And I've first of all I've shown a kind of a photo of the downtown, and it's the skyscrapers, and everybody understands that. And I show the forest photo and say, okay, so this is obviously not urban, right? And everybody agrees. And then you just zoom out the photo a little bit, and it turns out that actually once you zoom out a bit, you see all the pipelines that are running. And the photo is from northern Alberta in Canada, where a big part of the oil economy, not just of Canada, but of the whole world, actually. And the point that we discuss with this photo is that cities don't exist without this infrastructure that is, in this case, located very close to the Arctic. It's way up north. It's in the middle. It's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from any settlement, right? But that when we think about cities and their hinterlands, I think we're more likely to be thinking in the terms that you are, like that there's, there's a city and it's got maybe the farms surrounding it, and therefore places like Brussels, which exist in more kind of polycentric urban contexts, we think of those as kind of challenges to that idea. But I don't think that's right, because actually, the hinterlands in some sense of modern cities are not nearby. Sometimes some of them are, but actually, an enormous amount of the infrastructure that's both kind of natural and social to sustain urban life is located at kind of arbitrary spatial scales, right? And some of it's it's in the space as well, right? Satellites. I mean, it's the other kind of easy example of that. And so that, in fact, I think that the kind of condition of mega urbanization, polycentric urbanization, on the one hand, it kind of challenges us to think about larger and larger urban regions, and that's quite productive. But I don't think that itself kind of breaks us out of a mode of thinking that is very binary, because then instead of having the city versus the countryside, we have the mega region, versus the hinterland. And I think actually the challenge really is that on a kind of, intuitive, sense is to connect the very distant and not very obviously connected aspects of urban life with what's happening in the cities. And those, and some of that's in the forest, and some of that's in space, and some of that's in the ocean.
Matthew, you want on the question of maybe environmental policy protection of nature and so on, the fact that how to combine them within social policy and so on. Do you have some insight into this?
I don't have any simple response to that, except that I think that where environmental protection can be linked with wider social or cultural objectives, such as environmental education, a simple acknowledgement that nature is a source of pleasure and happiness for people and so on, then you begin to articulate a broader set of arguments. I get worried about some of the arid terminology, such as ecosystem services and terms like that, because I think it simply doesn't capture the richness of cultural interactions with nature.
Because often you get back to this utilitarian thinking of nature, isn't it?
Yes, sure. I think you come back to a certain kind of, if you like, a sort of biopolitical paradigm of state intervention, which tends to be expert-led, top-down, and so on. And you miss, in a contemporary context, you miss the richness of the grassroots ecological perspective. In some urban fields, such as botany or entomology, most of the knowledge is held by ordinary citizens, sometimes self-trained experts and others, but the knowledge is there, and how to articulate that in a broader framework, as I mentioned, where, if you like, regulatory agencies often lack the expertise to even interpret or understand the data that they're given. How do we build up the capacity for different forms of legal and political intervention linked to local communities?
Thanks a lot. Maybe we'll go over some questions in the audience this way. It can be also in French, ça peut être en français, si vous voulez. Je vois là de Monsieur Château-Renaud déjà.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a first question about the history of complex systems and how do you deal with this very long now history of 40 years maybe, or complexity and many scholars and tools and modeling. And for me, the question is, how can we connect the political aspects of ecology and the scientific or scientifical approach of this complexity? Because you have this very important notion of scale. The two presentations were concerned by this question of scale, with very local, national, maybe international with IPCC and so on. And how can you develop this aspect of connecting two different ways of governing complexity? Because in political side, it's very difficult to articulate the locals, the national, regional, national, international, and today the world is in a very bad state, as you see. And in a scientific approach, there is a big controversy about the possibility to develop really an approach on complexity with non-linear systems, with emerging phenomena and so on. And ecology is precisely in between the two difficulties. So I just want to hear your point on this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, it's an interesting question. I mean, for me, my thinking about this, I think about a certain kind of technocratic approach to complexity, the kind of the emergence of systems theory, systems thinking in the post-war era, where that I think is connected with some of the research I was discussing, the early attempts to measure the environmental impacts of cities, right? Is that took the systems approach, where I think that there was a hope, which is kind of shared among a lot of kind of systems thinkers in the time, that if we can correctly model the system, we can kind of solve it in some sense, right? And so that the kind of the broader kind of failure of that project, I think, is shared by the kind of environmental version of it, which is that you can't solve political problems with better models, right? And that's that you can understand in very detailed terms the way that resources flow through urban environments, but that tells you very, very little ultimately about distributional questions of which are actually solved with political fights. And so I think we've learned a lot in general, kind of from that simply kind of understanding the system isn't enough, but that I think that's a kind of a persistent tension that, and certainly the fact if I kind of bring this right up into the present, I would say that the more that we understand the solutions to our environmental problems as being fundamentally technological, which I think is increasingly the case, right? That it's the smart city that is going to solve our climate disaster. I mean, I don't think it's true, but anyway, a lot of people. There's a lot of kind of support for that idea that it's a kind of it really threatens a return to that post-war technocratic mentality where if we can just get the city to be smart enough, then our environment, then we won't have to use as much power and we'll be fine. But it will run into the exact same issues.
Yes, I would agree with David. I think that clearly. There are limits to what models or modeling can achieve, and I think possibly there's a danger at this historical moment with this particular interest in algorithms, cloud-based urbanism, big data, etc. There's a renewed emphasis on the possibilities to use, if you like, data modeling or data manipulation as a solution to underlying political questions.
Some other question, yeah, Marco?
It's not really, I don't know if it is a question. By the way, thanks for your interventions. Not easy to follow sometimes, but maybe because you're opening new routes. But I was wondering, sometimes our relation to nature, of suppose external nature, it's coming in risk situations. You often talked about disruptions, but in your publications, but also not just when this techno-scientific world, let's say, collapses, but also when, the forces, let's say, of nature manifest themselves. And this brings us to another relation to time, another relation to the unexpected, versus, if you want, a very techno-scientific way of understanding our life, which is maybe fixed, controlled. So how do you... because this encounter, unexpected encounter, is what sometimes we have in our life, and this mess up our agenda. And compared to the story of the cemetery, let's say, there is a notion. I think there is a relation to time by this tourist, let you say, and passionate of. That is related to their free time, let's say. It's not based on, let's say, how the life unfolds. So it's not an expected encounter to a certain extent. I don't know what it brings, but let's say I was wondering this relation to nature sometimes is involuntary, and many times we have these interfaces that we want somehow to close, or versus probably the episode of the cemetery, let's say, which talks about, I think, another way of understanding nature.
Maybe I can pick up on the risk thing there, because I think it's, I think one of the kind of interesting things about looking at urban environments, about in the natural environment in general, particularly if you start thinking about policy questions, is that there's always two things. There's always a kind of like the aesthetic and kind of affect, like the everyday, like the human relationship with nature, like that I think is tied up in environmental policy in, I think, sometimes unappreciated ways. That we understand, people we all have kind of preconceptions about what nature looks like. This is why I kind of emphasize this green and gray point, that there's something that kind of feels like nature, and we kind of it's not the same in every place and time, but there's something, in a given context, we kind of recognize that, and that is something that overlaps with environmentalism, right, in kind of an incomplete way. And when I'm thinking about risk, I'm thinking about something I've been looking at a lot is cities in kind of disaster planning and attempts to kind of, what was now sometimes called resilience, to prepare for environmental disasters and recover from them. And in New York, where I was based for a while, the Hurricane Sandy destroyed devastated the region. I was involved in some of the rebuilding efforts after there. And there was an amazing kind of tension between just to think of this example where on Staten Island in New York, it's the whole kind of coast of Staten Island, it used to be marshland, and now it's all houses, it's like a suburb. And it all got flooded, and you have among the residents there, a really interesting range of responses. So on the one hand, you have some residents who say, we want to leave, and please buy out our houses. They're asking the government, buy out their houses, and let's return this to marshland. And they rely on a kind of discourse saying, this, like, Mother Nature didn't intend for this to be a city. Mother Nature intended for this to be a marsh, so let's let that happen. And then you have other, sometimes just a few hundred meters away, just kind of, the next community over on the waterfront, where they say, build the biggest wall you can build. And I'm not like, this isn't hypothetical, like I'm thinking, like I can give you the names, these two communities right next to each other, where one they're saying, just let this become a marsh, and the other saying, build the biggest wall you can build. And they're responding to the same threat, right? And it's like the same kind of environmental problem. And just with very, very different kind of like, again, kind of aesthetic ideas about what the city-nature relationship should look like. And I think that that's just a kind of a dramatic example of it on some level. But I think that this is a kind of like a general kind of problem. Another thing is, if you look at the climate action plans that cities prepare, and have done this, look at the covers. What's the color of all these plans on the cover? It's green, right? It is. Like, it's just, they're all green, and if they're not green, they're blue. And they're probably green and blue. And then you open up the plan, what are they talking about? They're talking about policies which don't have anything to do with trees or grass. They're about, limiting emissions. They're about, but there's always this kind of combination of the kind of expertise and then the like aesthetics, and that I think situations of kind of risk and like exception kind of sometimes dramatize that. But I think it's just kind of one of the really fundamentally interesting things about urban environments.
Just very quickly on the question of time, if I understood correctly, a couple of quick observations. Because of the finitude of human time, that feeds in, I think, into the particular kind of effective intensity of encounters with nature. And talking about saproxylic geographies and so on, you're really confronting the fact that we ourselves will be recycled in some bigger web of life. And these are obviously quite profound questions. At the same time, I think there's a growing interest in deep time and understanding cities and also the circulation of capital as historically specific manifestations. How are we to interpret the urban within a longer time frame that feeds into questions of the Anthropocene? So this question of time and temporalities, I think, poses very profound questions for us.
Thank you. Thank you for all both lecture, very, very fascinating. And I'd like maybe not really to ask a question, but just underline an aspect of your presentation that you maybe it's also to be commented. It is about your relation, the different register of representation of an ecology or an ecosystem that you have used both. Because David, it was very interesting what you were answering about the problem that you have with the visual representation with your students. But in fact, so you presented your chronology, your 3 eras, thanks to 3 schemes. Also maybe according to the starting point of Burgess. So this is a way for you, the visual scheme, to present this relation and the problem that are related to the possibility to find the boundary extensions and so on, exchanges. On the other hand, Matthew proposed a narrative in order to show us all the development of an ecology you started from an element, this bee, not the bee, sorry, but this insect. And then your narrative is really a sort of novel, a short novel, which is interrupted, but it could be also go on. I just underlined it because for us, affiliated to design disciplines, the two registers of representation, the schematic one and the narrative one, are different and are complementary, and are also maybe related to different history of our disciplines. And if we are in the interdisciplinary framework, I think that this kind of a subject is crucial for our possibility to create synergies.
Yeah, maybe it will be the masterclass methodology that we haven't talked about yet, but that is kind of the next step, will be part of this, with you, of course, Hélène, as well. Mm-hmm. You want to answer? Go on.
I could say I think that sounds exactly right, and maybe further that the problem of representation is kind of like, it's inherent in the sense of, this is, I think, Frederick Jameson's point that, the modern capitalist world, you can't understand it. All you can do is represent it. And when you represent it, you kind of emphasize one thing, not the other. So I'm one of the things I'm interested in is, these kind of representations of urban systems that aren't necessarily intended to raise questions about the boundaries, but they do make, they have something to say about that. And so kind of look and you can see the story develop, even if that's not the story that they're trying to tell.
Yes, a very nice observation. I mean, I think it partly links to the, if you like, the disciplinary vantage points from which David and I are speaking. Certainly in my own work has some affinities with environmental history, so possibly that links with your observation.
We had the last question by ERDF. Yeah, please go.
So we have time, I can ask also.
Yes, please go on.
Yeah, okay. In fact, I have 3 questions. One of them, but
short ones?
Short ones, okay. Okay, the first one was for David, in fact, but it has a long answer probably. I was going to ask the dangers of the term of metabolism in relation with 1930s with Chicago School, but in fact with National Socialism in Germany. I wanted to know more about this, and I wanted to also know more about the use of the term by Karl Marx. Does it affect the Chicago School or also the later eras?
What term? The term?
The term metabolism, you said that it was first used by Karl Marx in the area of Marx.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the second question is to, Matthew, yes. In fact, I didn't understood very well the relation between the forensic architecture and your area. So I know little about this forensic architecture of A.L. Weitzman, but I couldn't get the relationship you built in your narrative. So it would be great to get a little bit of that. And the third one is the issue of immigration. In fact, no one has talked about it, but if you are talking about cities and metabolisms and human and non-human protagonists, so we are in an era of big immigrations, global immigrations, and cities are taking lots of people inside their metabolism. So what do you think about this in your areas? Do you have opinions about this? Thank you very much.
So can you just repeat that last question? I didn't quite get it.
Last question was the immigration issue, the global immigration issue, and the interaction between cities and humans or non-human subjects. I mean, do you have a relation with immigration in your area? Do you see immigrators as a protagonist in environmental or urban issues? Is it a factor which should be seen? Can you understand it? No. Okay.
Immigration. Is immigration part of the urban political ecology agenda?
So on the first one about how Karl Marx uses metabolism and kind of what are the dangers, I mean, Marx read he read soil science. The early 19th century is a time when artificial fertilizers are kind of invented, and there's an enormous, there's wars fought over guano because of the understanding that guano, helps plants grow. And so this is a time when there's a huge innovation in soil science, and therefore a gigantic increase in agricultural productivity. Marx notices this and connects this with the growth of cities in kind of early industrialization. They're two halves of the same coin. Like there's a kind of technological development of the countryside for agriculture, and then there's the factories being developed in the cities. And so the first thing he just notes is that there's a kind of global metabolism of the way that nutrients get recycled through the soil, which is threatened by the development of the kind of global industrial system. Because historically, you grow your plants and the waste products get kind of recycled back into the soil very locally. But when you have an international system of shipping food around the world, there's a kind of a rift in that metabolism. So he had this idea of metabolic rift, which John Bellamy Foster kind of develops more recently. But then he also just kind of took that same metaphor, metabolism, and said, that also just characterizes how humans transform nature through labor. And then he also said it's also kind of a pretty helpful metaphor for understanding the way that commodities circulate in the economy, just purely as a metaphorical sense. So he had this kind of he drew this notion from Justus von Liebig, the soil scientist, and kind of extended it out to almost every dimension of human activity in this kind of very interesting way. But it's a totally separate story from the kind of the subsequent development of urban metabolism as a metaphor. Like the Chicago School, they weren't reading Marx. They were a little bit, but that wasn't where they were getting that from. They were kind of getting it from contemporary biology at in the early 20th century. As far as the kind of the problems with it, I think the one that I mentioned in the presentation, I'll come back to, is that human systems are not always characterized in a positive way by change and transformation and growth. That's a very specific set of priorities. And again, with cities, it's plausible. Cities historically have grown, but again, it connects also to your point about immigration. That isn't itself a constant, right? And a kind of a way of thinking about urban systems that prioritizes growth and change, is adequate to some cases and less adequate to others. So I think that there's a real kind of trickiness there. So that's what I'd say about that.
Okay, very interesting questions. I'd just like to actually address your first one initially about organicist metaphors and National Socialism. One of the things that strikes me is that within contemporary Anglo-American discourse, there's often a lack of attention to the historiography of key concepts, so that von Uexküll, who's been invoked in relation to other than human natures, and actually also wrote about insects, was anti-Semitic, a very enthusiastic supporter of National Socialism and so on. So maybe coming back to the question of history and the history of ideas, I think we need to really understand where some of these metaphors and ideas come from and what the implications are for reusing them, or if we do, being aware of the wider context within which they were originally formulated. So it's a very, very good observation, thanks. Your second point about linking between urban ecology and forensic architecture, I think that there are very interesting lines of intersection around citizen science and understanding the production of knowledge to be collaborative, to some degree democratized, new technological possibilities as well as new kind of analytical discourses. And specifically, I wanted to pick up on Eyal Weizman's focus on plants, and as I mentioned in the presentation, also invoke insects as highly sensitive sentinels that can be used to reconstruct processes of environmental change, including environmental degradation. If we were to scale up to the question of the Anthropocene and the sixth mass extinction, there's been discussion about the decline of bees, for example, but we now have new research coming out of Germany and elsewhere indicating a mass invertebrate decline. And clearly very important and significant data within which grassroots activities can play a role. So I think some very interesting potentials for commonality. And then finally, you touch on the question of migration and urban migration in particular, and clearly urban ecology needs to be very sensitive to questions, for example, of the persistence of nativist discourses in relation to particular kinds of cultural landscapes. And what certainly fascinates me, for example, in relation to urban botany, is the recognition of cosmopolitan ecologies that specifically challenge some of these earlier nativist ecological discourses. So in my other research in Berlin on the history of botany, I've been particularly interested in the way new ecological discourses emerging, particularly from the 1970s onwards, explicitly sought to distance themselves from earlier ways of ecological thinking.